Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again. This evening we want to look at something we're actually in the midst of, something that hasn't ended yet, and we're in the midst of a snowstorm and a bit of a blizzard in the Northeast. Boston is going to be spared the blizzard component of it, but that looks like it'll hit Maine. More generally, though, it's going to hit the whole Northeast of the United States and has already started. And we want to see if, in effect, Boston is up to snuff and whether they're considering these problems. And part of that is whether they're seeing the big picture, not just one storm after another. And we've had, in fact, this is the second of a three-storm sequence that we're in the midst of. But it's not just one storm after another. There's a pattern that's starting to emerge, and it's related to the changes in our global ecosystem. So we want to look at that whole question of the relationship between weather and climate, and whether Boston is ready for the kind of climate change that we can expect from here on out. So we'll be looking at this question in terms of the suggested title, Are You Climate Ready, Boston? Or for that matter, is New York? What about Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, London, Hong Kong, Lagos, Cairo? In fact, the entire world that has put its cities at sea level pretty much since Columbus discovered America. Or, since it wasn't lost, since he bumped into America, thinking it was India. Well, we've had a lot of public figures, including people like Tom Brokaw in the media, telling us about global warming, what you need to know. And he put together a documentary for the Discovery Channel a few years ago. They carried it. And you can see the drama that they try to sort of infuse it with, along with sort of drumbeat music in the background and shocking footage and the like. But how could this global warming be related to, in effect, the crises we may be facing in winter storms in the Northeast of the United States? Well, let's take a look and see how Tom introduced it in the first place.
Future of our planet. The skyscrapers in downtown New York City stand in 80 feet of water. Its famous subway system submerged.
Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Miami, they would all be underwater.
Melting ice has flooded the oceans. The Arctic ice cap is long gone. Severe weather relentlessly assaults the planet.
Record heat, record drought, record flooding. This is not a world we want to get into.
Crop failure, mass migration, riots, extinction. Global warming. Two words that often invoke dire predictions of the planet's future. But is this really our destiny?
This is the most serious of environmental problems. It's the one that we need to solve now.
We head to all corners of the globe.
The size of the population has declined. The future doesn't look good.
To speak with leading scientists.
Lighting events are clearly telling us that reefs are in trouble.
And examine the evidence to find out what global warming really means and if rising temperatures can truly make a difference between the world we know today and a world we may not recognize tomorrow.
Years ago, climate scientists were discussing whether the Earth was cooling down or warming up. Now, a vast majority of those scientists believe that global warming is real and it's having a dangerous impact on the planet that we inhabit. What caused those scientists to change their minds? What evidence did they uncover? And what have they determined about the future that you need to know?
Well, that's the question that you need to know. Here in Boston, what you need to know. Well, one of the things we need to know is that this is part of a much bigger process that's well beyond human control. Take a look.
The beginning of the most recent ice age was 70,000 years ago. The ice sheets expanded, the planet's landmass grew, and sea levels fell. Then temperatures rose again. The ice receded. Sea levels climbed and eventually settled at today's coastlines.
Now, this is a process that's been going on with some regularity for the last million years or so. About every 10,000 years, 10 to 12,000 years, there is a procession, that is a growth of ice sheets, and then a retreat. Procession, recession, procession, recession. This is what climate scientists and geologists have established as fact in human history, because we've been about 1 million years old as a species, and we've endured several of these procession and recession moments. It's only in the last 10,000 years or so that we've had the recession and the emergence of the climates that we're used to. But the process is one that's periodic and quite dramatic in thousands of year terms. The question is not whether this happens. The question is, how fast does it happen, and where are we in this process? Well, that's where the scientists have come in with some very dramatic statements, and these are very unsettling. As Jim Hansen has put it, the leading climate scientist in the former NASA position where he was, the head of the Goddard Space Science Study Center, it's been very clear. The ice is melting at this point at a rate that it hasn't been seen to melt in human history. Take a look. The staggering aspect of it is caught in these documentaries.
Antarctica, the world's greatest freezer, is melting. Trillions of gallons are draining into the oceans. Sea levels are rising. It's happened before, and it's happening again, right now.
It's not a question of will sea level rise a large amount. It's only a question of how fast that will occur.
Okay, that's it. It's not a question of will sea level rise a large amount. It's only a question of how fast that will occur. And in fact, he and others, in fact, a whole team of tens of thousands of scientists working since the 1980s, have now established that that will occur faster because of what humans have been doing with the burning of fossil fuels. And we can expect the new normal to be studded with superstorms, high tides, and rising seas. That natural process of the retreat of ice sheets leading to the rise of sea level is underway, but humans have accelerated it with their use of fossil fuels. Now, we can see this dramatically in winter storms as they start to take on huge expanses. These aren't local storms anymore. They're the entire width of the East Coast. And historically, it's important to keep in mind they've been going on like this over hundreds of years.
When I went to the city and made them aware of the hurricane problem based on the history of New York, the media picked it up and called me Dr. Doom. A few years ago, somebody asked me, do they still call you Dr. Doom? I said, no, they're calling me quite often now. The scope of devastation of Sandy surprised even me. And that was simply because the jet stream got involved and the tremendous thermal difference between snow in the Appalachians and a hurricane that was riding the Gulf Stream caused a 1,000-mile tropical monster Add to that, you have the most built up and populated coastal segment in the United States at risk. And you have people that don't believe it can happen. And until Sandy, they really didn't believe it could happen until we discovered that hurricanes had been hitting the Northeast in 1635. And you can never argue with history, it's there.
Not a good idea to argue with history. He's a forensic hurricanologist. He studied the historical hurricanes that go back several hundreds of years, and he can find it in the residue of the sands and sediments left off the coast. This is why he's a geologist, not a meteorologist, and he's looked at the traces that have been left in the sands and sediments off the coast of previous dramatic hurricanes.
And joining us now is Dr. Nicholas K. Koch. He's a coastal geologist at Queens College of the City University of New York. Sir, good morning to you.
Yeah, thank you.
It has been how long since New York has seen something like this?
Oh, quite a few years, but this is a replay of a hurricane that hit New York City in 1821. 1821. And it literally hit every city at that time on the way up. I never thought that would happen again.
He never thought it would happen again, but that's what's starting to happen again. Every city on the way up the East Coast.
And when it hit New York City, the tide rose 13 feet in 1 hour.
Of course, the predictive models were slightly less accurate in 1821.
Right.
So what do we have to do right now?
Stay away from the water and get yourself in a wind-resistant building.
There's been a lot of talk about these buildings because I think people, especially who are on upper floors, say living in the 20th floor of a high-rise building, are very concerned. So what are the issues and the concerns there?
Well, the wind velocity will increase with the higher stories. And if you experience trouble, get away from the windows. Put as many walls between you and the windows as possible. And if necessary, get into an interior stairwell, which I believe with New York City code has to be concrete.
Because if it hits tropical storm force winds at ground level, it's possible that it could basically be hurricane force winds.
Absolutely.
Now, this is actually very interesting. Tropical storm force winds are measured at ground level, but up in a building, they're quite a bit higher, and conceivably hurricane force up there. Now, this is a fellow who studied New York very carefully, and he's looked particularly at both tide and wind. And tide, he's pointed out, is particularly important because of the way it is angled from the coastline. The coastline creates a right angle, and the tide coming from a counterclockwise circulation shoves itself into this area with a very rapid rise in basically storm surge that comes very quickly. So you can expect a storm surge in New York, but also up in Boston. We have very interesting confluences of weather in this area.
Here in Boston, we have some very interesting weather risks, thanks to the fact that we're located between the cold interior of Canada and the very warm waters of the Gulf Stream. We have some of the strongest temperature gradients on the planet. This is why we have such phenomenal weather, like last winter's blizzards, and also why we get the occasional hurricane. And even more worrying than straight hurricanes are what we call extratropical transitioning storms. Those are hurricanes that gang up with winter storms, create mayhem. Hurricane Sandy, which affected New York more than Boston, is an example of that. Now, sea level is going up, temperatures are going up, and we expect that to continue through the century thanks to the phenomenon of global warming. Unfortunately, just the sea level rise all by itself will exacerbate coastal flooding due to hurricanes coming up the coast, and particularly due to these extratropical transitioning storms, also nor'easters. One of the concerns we have is that you can couple a storm surge, which causes coastal flooding, with freshwater flooding from particularly heavy rains from these events, so that you would do things like flood the Charles and Mystic rivers. we're working actively to try to really understand this risk quantitatively, but it is a concern for Boston and surrounding neighborhoods going forward this century.
Sure is a concern going forward this weekend, because look at the forecast.
And by 4, that rain snow line starts to drop off to the south and east. Snow across the Berkshires, Taconic, Litchfield Hills, into the whites and greens, and across most of Maine. And that's where we're expecting the storm system to really ramp up. And it turns into a blizzard for some. And I think the highest threat for that's going to be north of Boston. And then going into Monday morning, you think the storm's over with, but it slows down, it puts on the brakes, and we see some wraparound with that strong northwest wind. Low pressure again, developing off the coast. It transfers its energy to a coastal storm in the Gulf of Maine, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, the wind's starting to ramp up 39 to 59 miles per hour.
Okay, tomorrow morning, the winds will start to ramp up 39 to 59 miles an hour at surface level. Anyone up in a high-rise is going to feel more than that. You can see the same structure of a counterclockwise storm meeting in here, a kind of cul-de-sac in the Boston area, will lead to really severe weather and flooding with flow off of the continent of water from upstream.
Watch these oranges start to appear from down east through the Cape. Those are wind gusts between 58 and 74 miles per hour. So
58 and 74 miles per hour tomorrow morning.
Hurricane-force wind gusts are possible with 20 to 25 foot seas, a 1 to 3 foot storm surge, and we'll likely see some beach erosion and moderate coastal flooding with that noontime high tide from the Gulf of Maine through the North Shore and Cape Cod Bay.
Right, likely to see some coastal erosion and flooding. Why? Well, because all of the ingredients there for the storm surges that were coming into New York in Sandy are here in Boston. Storm surge is quite a vulnerable category for Boston because we're separated from the ocean by only a few meters and 1 or 2 dams. Storm surge could do quite a bit of damage if it overtopped the Charles River Dam here. It would then flood up the Charles River. And the Mystic River back here is something that falls off the radar of some people looking only at Boston, but it's the whole Boston area that we've got to look at. Fortunately, the Boston Research Advisory Group, or BRAG, has started to look at this very seriously. In fact, they published a report called Climate Ready Boston. And they did this in June of this last year, June 1st, 2016 was their report, just in time for us to prepare for this winter. The question is not whether the experts have read it, they know about it. Even the city planners know about it, even the mayor himself knows about it, and in fact he has convened a Green Ribbon Commission to look at this whole question of climate change and sea level rise projections for Boston. But the question is whether the public knows anything about it and has any awareness of what could be happening here.
There's so many vulnerabilities for the city of Boston as it relates to our waterfront and sea level rise that now we have to start planning and make sure that we can ensure that Boston can continue to thrive. There's several different things that are on the table in terms of whether that's looking at a harbor-wide solution that would really protect not just Boston but some of our neighboring cities, but then also some more localized solutions.
Is this actually based on what you guys are seeing, or are you just buying into it wholeheartedly?
Some parts of the city along our waterfront at king tide, the highest high tide of the year, we're already seeing the harbor come over on the top of our protected areas. And so it's something that we're seeing already, but we recognize that as we see these trends in sea level rise on our tide gauge, that we need to be prepared for even more serious consequences in the future.
So what historical sites or monuments are most in jeopardy right now?
I think some of the ones that people would recognize right away would be Faneuil Hall, where some of the first meetings for the American Revolution took place. By the end of the century, that could be actually getting water on a daily basis at the high tide.
Yeah, that's interesting. Faneuil Hall is right down there near the harbor. In fact, not far, walking distance, couple blocks from where they held the Tea Party, right? The original Tea Party against the British in the American Revolutionary War. Well, it'd be very interesting to see if Tea Party enthusiasts started to take on climate change and sea level rise as a civic problem that they should be addressing. Give a whole new complexion to the Tea Party, and in fact the whole meaning to historic Boston. You can take the duck tours and everything else, but if you started to walk through historically grounded events in Boston, you'd see most of them would be underwater. So it's time for the Tea Party to get serious about climate change and do something specifically here in Boston.
We want to make sure that we're looking at the most vulnerable areas of the city of Boston and coming up with what those solutions look like from a feasibility standpoint, what they would cost, and then also compare that to what a harbor-wide solution would look like to make sure that we're doing the most cost-effective thing, but also at the same time making sure that we have plans in place to protect some of our most vulnerable residents. Right now, we're in the process actually of developing what some of those feasibility studies would look like for some of that green infrastructure or gray infrastructure for some of the more localized, severely impacted areas in the near term.
Well, that's what's needed, and what's needed as well is a lot of discussion among the public. Yes, there will be hurricanes, but what about these hurricane force winds that come in the middle of the winter? What we're going to find out is that, and what we need to know, and the public needs to know, is that in Boston, the biggest threat from global warming may come in the coldest time of the year. This is made clear by Harvard University professor.
I've had considerable experience observing wind and water disasters and studying them closely. Whether it's Bangladesh or the Indus River floods in Pakistan or Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, there are a number of principles that we need to bear in mind when you think about disaster response.
She goes on to lay those principles out and listen to her conclusions. It's pretty staggering.
Hitting the north and the southern coastal areas as well, that could last for up to weeks. The other big issue is going to be food supply and heat. The food will be rapidly consumed in the retail settings that still have it. And then the resupply to the Boston area will be encumbered by snow, some flooding, and the problems of getting big trucks into Boston to retail areas and distribution. So my sense is that Boston is prepared for many disasters, but the population is not prepared, is not adequately educated about the impending fast danger of a major northeaster storm surge, snow, and ice, and then the long tail afterwards that will require considerable self-sufficiency.
Well, that's sobering. Basically, our biggest threat may not be from the hurricanes in the summer, but these northeasters with hurricane-force winds in the winter. And the enduring threat is got to do with what's right around the harbor. Take a look.
January of 2006, ExxonMobil spilled 10,000 gallons of oil into the Mystic River. They should have said, "We are sorry, mea culpa, it's our fault," but they didn't do that. They didn't. For months, for years, they said, "Well, it's not our oil, it's not our oil, it's not our oil." You would think that they would have learned a lesson with a $5.6 million settlement. But 10 years later, they're still violating water quality permits. These are essentially permits to pollute.
Permits to pollute. Who's guilty? Well, ExxonMobil. They're guilty not only here, but in that Katrina circumstance we saw between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And the former CEO is now the Secretary of State. So it's not likely that we're in this moment going to receive a lot of national leadership in anticipating or coping with climate change in Boston. There have been citizen initiatives looking at this, and we need a lot more, because if you look at this whole question, it's true it's going to be hitting hard here in Boston, but it's hitting everywhere. And it's hitting in such a way that large portions of the land will disappear in the very near future. We urgently need a new kind of citizen scientist alliance for a transition to a sustainable future.